É Gorbis. Olá pessoal, sejam muito bem-vindos e bem-vindas a mais um conteúdo do Summit Firjan IEL e Festival Futuros Possíveis 2020. Se você já está acompanhando a gente até aqui, eu sou a Karen de Souza, estou acompanhando e participando desse evento aqui com vocês. É importante frisar, a gente deixou bem evidente aí antes do início dessa transmissão, de que todo mundo está tomando bastante cuidado aqui na Casa Firjan para evitar mesmo o contágio do coronavírus, tá ok? Nós estamos bem seguros por aqui. Gente, a gente acabou de sair de uma palestra super interessante com o Rio, que é da Unesco, falando sobre a importância dos estudos de futuro. A gente já entendeu muito bem a relevância e a importância desses estudos e agora a gente vai conhecer algumas ferramentas disponíveis para que a gente possa não somente reagir às mudanças, mas também criá-las. A gente convida para isso, então, a Marina Gorbis, que é diretora executiva do Institute for the Future e autora do livro A Natureza do Futuro, Despachos do Mundo Socializado. E para bater esse papo com a Marina, a gente tem aqui a gerente de conteúdo e inovação empresarial da Casa Firjan, Maria Isabel Ocherry. Minha gente, novamente eu faço o pedido para que vocês continuem participando e também o agradecimento em todas as palestras e nossos conteúdos. Vocês têm enviado perguntas muito interessantes e que têm tornado o nosso evento ainda melhor. Não façam diferente dessa vez, viu? Continuem mandando perguntas para que a gente possa incorporá-las a esse conteúdo, tá? Então, com vocês agora, por que pensar como um futurista, antecipando cenários e as oportunidades?
Hi, Marina. First, I'd like to say we're honored to have you participating in this event, so thank you again for joining us, sharing your vision, your experience. So, I'd like to start by asking you about the work of Institute for the Future. So, I've learned you work there for 22 years now, so that's quite a lot of time. So can you explain to us a little bit of your background, what the Institute does, and how a day in your life looks like?
Sure. Well, day in the life today is very different from my regular day, what I think in my 22 years. But the Institute is actually, so I've been at the Institute for 22 years, but the Institute is 52 years old. It's a nonprofit research organization dedicated to helping people systematically think about the future, not because we think that anybody can predict the future, but we do think that there are important tools and ways of thinking about the future that help people make better decisions and choices today. So although we, in our work, look sometimes 5, 10 more years out, ultimately what we are trying to do is help people make better choices, imagine different possibilities, and prepare for different possibilities to ultimately build a better future. One of the things we talk about is that our mission is to disrupt short-termism. So much of how we operate today and how people act is very much into short term. And if you think about what we're experiencing today with the pandemic, it's something that was very much predictable and people talked about it, but we failed to act on that. So it's because we have so many incentives in our daily lives and our organizations to act on the short term and not to take into account the longer term possibilities, the longer term trends that are likely to shape our lives. So at the Institute, we're very much dedicated to thinking about what are these big underlining sort of tides of change and how we can shape them to ultimately create a better future, whether it's for organizations, for individuals, for communities, for anybody really, for governments.
And how challenging is that? Because Your work, you work with organization, with business, and one thing that we wonder is how challenging it is for implementing this futures mindset in companies. So where should company leaders start, and professionals, where should they begin to start exercising this mindset?
Yeah, it's not that doing the futures work is challenging, right, in itself. I think what's challenging is for people to act on the results of that futures work, because as I said, there are a lot of different tools that people use for thinking about the future. You know, one of the things we always talk about is looking at signals, things that are happening today around us that we don't pay attention to, but there are signals of something bigger. So it's something that's on the margin. It's something that looks kind of different and crazy maybe. It could be a new technology. It could be a new sort of way of thinking. It could be a scientific discovery. It's something that's already here. But if you don't pay attention to it, you may miss the larger impacts of this, because what is a signal and is a small thing right now can grow in importance. You know, there's this famous phrase by William Gibson, who is a science fiction writer, and he wrote that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. There are signs and signals of the future all around us. So, but being able to spot them and identify whether it's a signal or a noise, what is the larger patterns that it's telling you, is really, really important. So for anybody in the, you know, as I said, yes, of course, as a professional futurist, the more you do this work, the better you get. But there are ways that people can learn this in many different ways. You know, they can take, of course, our class. We teach future thinking and future design classes. But even without that, you know, reading about it, you know, first thing is create kind of an infrastructure in an organization where people are incentivized to look for those signals, to come together and talk about it. Why is this happening? What's important? You know, one important piece of it is also, and this is something that we practice in our work, is to have kind of diverse groups of people in conversation about what they're seeing and how they're seeing these things. Because each one of us, we may be looking at the same similar phenomena, but, you know, if you come from like design background, you're spotting something different and you see different insight in it. Or if you're an economist, you may be seeing slightly something different. So it's really important to create teams in organizations and groups that are each kind of looking at these signals, but they're also coming together and they're having conversations about what it means and what are the insights. So that's just one part of it. In our work, we also look at historical patterns because, again, this famous quote from Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. There are certain patterns in history that tend to repeat themselves, and it's important for us to put those things in kind of historical context, understand how what we're seeing today fits into these patterns or doesn't fit. So in our work, almost every project we do, we start with understanding history. Like what do we know historically about how something like this happened, or what's the historical context, how do we get to today?
That's super interesting. So to think about the future, you also have to think about the past, right?
Absolutely.
So the day today is about future studies, and you've already mentioned some practices, but we know there's many methodologies, many different approaches. So I wonder if there's a favorite, or if you have a different approach for a different profile or a different situation. Is there such a thing? Is there a moment where you should use one kind of methodology, one kind of approach, and a moment where you'd use another?
Yeah. You know, one kind of unique thing about the Institute is that we call ourselves methodologically agnostic, meaning, you know, there are certain futures organizations that specialize in scenarios, and there are other futures organizations that look at trends. or other things. So we basically look at every area, every domain that we're trying to explore, and then fit it with the kind of methodology that we think is most appropriate. I have to confess, my favorite methodology, and this is something that we just actually completing work on, is we kind of pioneered this field called ethnographic foresight. And it basically combines what anthropologists do, which is ethnography, really observing people and their daily lives and routines, whether it's at work or at home, and just to understand what are people experiencing, how they're experiencing today, and particularly some new phenomena. Where we're applying a lot of this work is understanding what's happening with work and jobs. So we just completed a round of interviews with people who are making less than $15 an hour, which is considered low wage in here in the US and California, particularly during this COVID time, to understand how they're coping with this. And it's very here and now. And then we combine that with futures trends and understanding, sort of putting their experiences into this larger context of why. So we're seeing, for example, that people increasingly turning to various kinds of platforms, whether it's Uber or Lyft or Craigslist or other, to find work. And it's not traditional kind of work. It's literally people selling an hour of their times, or sometimes minutes of their time, if you're a mechanical Turk. And of course, this is enabled by these technologies and platforms, but it's a very different way of working. And if you understand the larger sort of technology trends and the whole evolution of platforms and how that's been going on for 10 years now, then you can really say, okay, what these people are experiencing is not just about COVID. It's not just a reaction to COVID. There's something bigger going on. There's a way of working that is different from what we traditionally think of as kind of institutional or structured formal work. It's something going on that's worth paying attention to. And then you identify, like, what are the challenges with this kind of work? And there are a lot of challenges. And ultimately, how can we shape that? Given that, how can we shape it to have a good experience for workers?
So, Marina, since you mentioned work and new forms of work, do you think the pandemic was a catalyst for what's going on? Do you think the future of work will be something built upon what's happening now? So the gig economy and the uses of all these platforms. What is your vision on that?
I do think that COVID is somewhat an accelerator of this, but everything we're seeing today has started happening a while back. I remember writing an op-ed that was called "It's Not About Uber." Everybody was concerned, and still are so concerned about Uber and these ride share apps. And you have to look underneath and understand that Uber is enabled by certain kinds of technologies and certain regulatory system or lack of regulatory system that enables something like Uber. And the same sort of technologies you're able to use them even for knowledge work, where you can basically take jobs or flows of work and divide them into tasks, kind of decode them, and then hire people to do pieces of this work in different places, right? So it's not just about Uber. Uber accelerated. Now you have to combine that understanding with also another trend, which is the decline of what we see as large public corporations. This is in the US. The corporations whose shares are traded on public markets, right? And these corporations were traditionally large employers. And so we're seeing sort of decline of these forms, of corporate forms, and the new kinds that are coming into market that we are interacting every day. They're very efficient, but they don't require a lot of people. So if you combine that, the technologies are there, and then you have kind of decline of these larger formal corporate forms, it's not, and lack of regulation, at least for now, of these new forms, because we haven't evolved that regulatory system yet. It's very new. You can see why this is an ongoing trend. And by the way, it's built on top of something else that's been going on for probably 40 years. There's an economist, David Weil, who wrote the book on fissured work, which is basically the kind of work where you're working for a company, but you are not a direct employee. So you work for a vendor, you're a contractor, you're a gig worker, and that's been going on for 40 years. If you think about outsourcing a lot of IT work in the US and other kind of outsourcing, that's been going on since the 80s probably.
Mm-hmm. So going back to methodologies, I have a question. I'm a designer myself, and designers are supposed to imagine future states. And you mentioned a little bit of ethnography, which is also something that designers use as a methodology, but I'd like to hear your take on what's the difference and similarities between a futurist and designers. Is it all about imagination, creativity, or where is the difference?
I think there's a lot of overlaps, and we teach a design futures course, my colleague.
Exactly, and some futurists call themselves designers, so that's
right,
yeah.
Right. And there is an overlap. You know, there was a colleague of ours who's a designer, and she did a presentation at the Institute, and it sort of clarified in my mind, I think, the difference between the two. She was talking about a project she was doing in China, where they were working with a company, and as you know, in China there's a lot of pollution, and sometimes there's indoor pollution and there's outdoor pollution, and on some days pollution is worse outside, and then some days pollution is worse inside. So they were trying to figure out how to deal with that, and the solution was to create a sensor that you would put on the window, and it will sense when the pollution is worse and open or close depending on that. And to me it clarified, like, okay, that's exactly what a lot of designers do. They look at the existing parameters and systems and say, what's the best design we can come up with to deal with the situation? A futurist would look and say, okay, what can we do to deal with pollution in China? So you can see there's overlap there. It's about systems. It's about understanding larger systems, and that requires, this is why I was saying that it requires a lot of different things. It requires understanding history, like what is causing this kind of pollution? You know, is it likely to grow? What's the demographics? What's the economic data behind it? What's likely to happen? You know, what's the regulatory and policy mechanism? And ultimately, probably as a futurist, it would be to think about, okay, what do we need to do to change the system in which this is taking place? Similarly, when we are thinking about work and what's happening with work, it's not necessarily that we say, you know, this kind of work is bad or good. It's not good right now because it's existing in a system where, particularly in the US, we don't have a safety net that accommodates people. A lot of benefits are tied to traditional workplaces. So it's not good in this system. But what is the system that we need to create to make this a good type of work?
Mm-hmm. Marina, I have some questions here from our chat. So one person asked if there are any specific methodology or tips that you would share with small companies to better prepare themselves for the future. So here, especially in the state of Rio, most of the companies are small, micro companies. So how should they start thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, any company can do it. I would say if you're a small company, first of all, you know, everybody in the company, it doesn't have to be a department or somebody specifically trained, but I would say train everybody in the company or a lot more people in the company in future thinking. Just make it into a daily practice for a lot of people, and then allow them a platform or a place where they can exchange this, so that you have a whole group within the company who are kind of future sensing and have that expertise. I think it's a really important competency for anybody, equally for business, people who are in business, people, students, in people working in education. It's just that, to me, futures literacy today is an essential skill. So the more people can be exposed to, the more you can train people, the better. In terms of sort of resources and, think about combining and aggregating and having a whole number of companies who are some of the underlying trends and some of that sort of, I would say, fuel for futures work is similar for a lot of companies. So, some countries, and in Brazil, I know that you are probably involved, Firjan, and we work with Sinai, of building that competency and resources that become available to a lot of companies, including small companies. And so sort of aggregating and becoming part of it is another way of accomplishing that.
Good to know. No excuses then for small companies. I have another question here, and seems there's more designers. So someone asked, should futurism be taught in a design degree? Does that make sense?
I believe that futurism should be taught everywhere. So absolutely, I think it's a really, as I said, I think it's a foundational skill. I oftentimes tell people, if I were to remake the education system overall, if I were in charge of the world, I would remake the education system around how we train people in thinking about the future, because it's really, we live in a very complex environment, right, where I do believe that there's specializations that's needed. At IBM, they have this concept of T people, so you've got kind of an expertise in a narrow area, but that's your STEM, right, like this. And you have this, the top, where you need to be able to connect it with a lot of different areas. And so to me, futures work enables you to really take that systemic view of whatever issue you're looking at. So I do think for designers, when you're approaching building something, and particularly, even the app, so many apps that are being designed, and now we're seeing this, they have huge ethical issues that people have not thought about that are worth thinking about. A lot of the apps that we're using for work, they're not just apps, they're also distributing work and determining people's salaries and how much money they're making. There are huge sort of social and ethical implications of what people are building, because we perceive the world, we live in a designed world, and that how we design that world influences how we think, how we perceive that world, and ultimately how we behave.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about that film on Netflix, The Social Dilemma, so I think people now are becoming a bit more aware of that. Unfortunately, we're almost in our last minutes, so I have one last question that's more abstract maybe, and then Marina, please add your thoughts that you wish to add. So we understand we can't predict the future, but do you think futures literacy is about being better prepared for it, or is it more about designing the future you wish for? Where are we standing when we're doing futures literacy?
Yeah, I think it's both. And some people probably would want to, sometimes when we work, people want us to come up with scenarios or forecasts, and they want to say, how do I prepare for this? And that it's almost like an inoculation. How do I inoculate this vaccine, right? So I've thought about it, I prepared, and I'm kind of ready. I think the other way to think about it is about this imagination, which is ultimately, we say that future begins in your imagination, that unless you can't build something, before you build something, you have to imagine it. And there's a lot of reimagination that frankly needs to be happening right now, and a lot more people need to be engaged in that. And I think that imagination is the first step ultimately to thinking about what's the future we want to build, and imagine that. And sometimes it's pretty radical and very different than what we are used to. But it's the first step to then saying, what do we need to do to get there? So it's both.
Okay, that's very interesting. Marina, thank you once again so much. Unfortunately, our time is up, but I have good news because we're going for a break, a 15-minute break, and Marina will guide us during this break because, as we did yesterday, we have breaks with content, so we always have some kind of activity that helps you unwind a little bit before continuing with all the dense talks and food for thought. So Marina will guide us through a break mini training, which is a game called 5 Minutes in the Future. So it sounds very exciting. And then, so we just have to leave this link, and as you've been going with the other talks in the website, go to the next link. And then after the break, we will continue with Marco Aurelio Cesarino. So he's a product director at Embraer X. So he will share us a real company case about this futures thinking in practice. So Marina, thank you once again. And if you have one last word or one last tip to share with us, please do.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for sharing. I'm just, participate in the next exercise. It's going to be fun, and I really encourage you to get to know more, learn more about future thinking, and start practicing it.
We will, starting now. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.